People often think that the Quran is a book of laws, or that Islam is a religion that's all about doing certain things and staying away from other things. It's about commands and prohibitions. And there are a lot of commands and prohibitions in Islam. But that's not the central focus of the Quran. The central focus of the Quran, in terms of what it's telling human beings to do and its way to be in the world, is its emphasis upon virtue, certain kinds of virtues that you must have. And I'll talk about the different virtues in Islam in a few minutes. So it's really ultimately about conforming yourself outwardly, but so that you develop this virtue inwardly. It's not just a matter of giving your required charity because the Quran tells you you have to give your charity, and Islamic law tells you you have to give your charity. Of course, you do have to do that. And even if you do it because that's the law, you will be rewarded for it. But ultimately, the purpose, of course, is to make you a charitable person, to make you a person who is charitable of your own nature rather than charitable in response to a particular command. Now, these things, let's say outward actions or and belief and ihsan, are all interrelated and they're progressive. So, for example, when Islam first emerged in Arabia, and I'm not sure if I don't think you've had the lecture yet on the life of Muhammad, but toward the end of Muhammad's life, just about all of Arabia, which was pagan at that time, had converted to Islam. And you had a number of tribes and tribal groups that en masse came to Muhammad and said, we accept Islam, without really knowing a whole lot about it, right? For some of them, it was a political move. And there was one case where a group of tribal nomads had come to Muhammad and said to him, excuse me, we believe. And the response in the Quran was, don't say that you believe, because belief hasn't yet entered your heart. Say you have submitted to yourselves. You've become Muslims. You've submitted yourself to Islam, which is Islam means submission. But you're not yet mu'min. You're not yet someone who has Iman. But that was all right. Because the conception was that a group of people who conformed themselves outwardly to this religion, that this would provide fertile ground for Iman to grow. It isn't something that you had to have before necessarily. You could submit yourself, and then the Iman would grow within. And even if you have some degree of Iman, right, some degree of faith, the practice of the requirements of Islam would help that faith to grow. At the same time, as one increases in Iman, one is also able to increase in Ihsan. Because remember, you have to worship God as if you see Him. It's hard to do that if you don't really believe in Him. Right? The more perfect your Iman is, the more perfect your belief in God is, the easier it is going to be for you to constantly live your life as if you see Him standing before you. So they're related to one another. Right? They're not separate. All right, there are three things in the Quran that help us to understand what virtue is from an Islamic perspective. And the first of those things is the 99 names of God. In the Quran, God is either called by particular names or certain verbal actions are attributed to Him, and those become the basis of what Muslims recognize as the 99 names of God. And they are attributes of God. So the compassionate, the merciful, the just, the knowing, the hearing, the seeing, the kind, the subtle, right? The majestic, the awesome. Right? There are all of these different names for God, 99 altogether that Muslims traditionally count. Now, some of those names represent qualities that human beings are not necessarily expected to try to imitate, like all-powerful or all-seeing, right? Or compelling. One of the names of God is the compeller. Right? Some of those names of God are what describe what makes God completely other in relation to human beings. But others of those names represent qualities that it would be very good for human beings to acquire, right? To be merciful or to be generous or to be kind. And those names altogether are referred to as the Asma al-Husna. And the word Husna comes from the same root as Ihsan. So it's often translated as the beautiful names. So part of Ihsan, or one way to understand Ihsan, is for a human being to try to himself or herself imitate those qualities, those noble qualities that are attributes of God. Right? So virtue is to be generous because God is generous. It's to be just because God is just. To be compassionate, to be merciful. Now, there was one Islamic mystical writer who once said, truly, no person acquires virtue. This is from a mystical perspective. What they ought to do is they should stand in the light of the divine virtue, let's say, of generosity, and reflect it. Right? So that actually there's this sense of acquiring virtues has a certain sort of egotistical element in it. I am charitable, right? I am generous. But the idea that you sort of efface yourself, you're reflecting God's generosity. All right, the second thing that helps us to understand what ihsan is in the Quran is the fact that it's connected in some ways to the idea of love, particularly the love of God. The Quran talks about God loving certain kinds of people, but it never talks about God loving any kind of people more than it talks about him loving the people who practice ihsan. In multiple places in the Quran, it says God loves the muhsineen, that is, the people who practice ihsan, people who practice virtue. God is the friend of the believers, right? He's the ally of the believers. He protects them, but he loves the people who perform virtue. So performing virtue, again, is to make yourself beautiful and good so that you are therefore lovable in the eyes of God. Right? And the third major way that we can think about what ihsan is from the Quran is an interesting verse of the Quran, which says in Arabic, hal jaza al-ihsan illa al-ihsan, which means, is the reward of virtue anything but virtue? Right? It's like virtue is its own reward, right, as we say in the English saying. But it's almost identical in the Quran. Hal jaza al-ihsan illa al-ihsan. Is the virtue, is the reward of ihsan anything other than ihsan itself? Now, when the Quran talks about doing certain things, like believing in a certain way or following certain prescriptions and doing certain things, it often talks about its reward. The reward of someone doing this will be paradise, will be a great joy in the next life, or good in this life and good in the next life will be the reward for doing certain things. But when it talks about ihsan, the reward is ihsan itself. Right? So if we take these three things together, we can say that the difference between ihsan and a person doing good deeds in any other context, right? It's within the context of Islam or Iman, has to do with one's intention, why you are doing it. Right? If you're practicing ihsan, you're practicing it because you want to be closer to God. You want to reflect his virtues. You want to be lovable in the eyes of God. Or three, and I never wrote it down, you want to beautify yourself. Right? For the beauty, for the love of being beautiful itself, or having that kind of virtue, or that kind of beauty. Okay. All right, now, when we talk about what kinds of virtues you have in Islam, certainly they're not that different from what you would find in other religious traditions, right? You're supposed to be charitable and merciful and all of those kinds of things. But I want to talk a little bit about the specific ways in which those virtues are talked about in the Quran or talked about in Islam. First of all, we come back to this idea of taqwa. Taqwa is in many ways the basis of all virtue in Islam. Right? One behaves virtuously because one has a reverential fear or awe of God. So the idea of taqwa is, in a sense, the basis of all virtues, or one might think of it as the highest of all virtues. And there is a very famous hadith of the Prophet, sallallahu alaihi wasallam, where he says that the best of you is the best in piety. That is the basis of nobility among human beings, is the degree to which they reflect this quality of taqwa. Or in a passage of the Quran where it's talking about the fact that God has given human beings clothing and ornaments with which to cover themselves. Right? And it says, of course, that God gives human beings clothing and raiment and garments and ornaments to cover themselves, to adorn themselves as a good thing, something that they should have and that they should enjoy. But it says the best clothing or the best covering is the clothing of taqwa. So then we come back to this idea of the connection between inner beauty and outer beauty, that the most beautiful way in which you can clothe yourself in front of others is through the clothing of piety, or the clothing of taqwa, a reverential fear, right? Because that would be the basis then of all of the virtues. Another important element, if taqwa is sort of the basis, another important element in terms of virtue in Islam in general is the idea of moderation, or the idea of balance. And this is something that makes Islam somewhat distinctive in certain regards in relation to other religious traditions. The idea of balance, or the balance, is a very important concept, a very important metaphor, a metaphorical idea, a very important concept in the Quran. The Quran says over and over again, God has set the balance. Don't transgress the balance. So this idea of moderation or balance is really essential to the Islamic way of life and to the Islamic practice of virtue. Right? So I always think about this when I hear the term Islamic radical. Because ultimately, the virtues in Islam are supposed to be moderation, and I'll explain what I mean. For example, in terms of the money that one has, Islamic tradition in the Quran say you should spend the money that you have, whatever money God has given you. Right? You shouldn't be overly miserly. You shouldn't hoard your wealth and say, I'm not going to spend the money. I'm going to keep putting it away under my bed or in my bank or my 401k or whatever it is, and not spend that money. Hoarding your money, saving it for a rainy day. No, that's not what you should be doing. Nor should you be exceedingly prodigal in how you spend. Right? Nor should you be a spendthrift and spend it on anything. Both of those point to certain vices, right? Hoarding your wealth, first of all, shows a lack of trust in God, right? I'm hoarding it because I never know what's going to happen, right? It's that kind of fear and that anxiety that thwarts the trust in God, which is an important virtue. And at the same time, it's something that shows a kind of desire to hold on to the provision of this world and not to recognize that it comes from God, that what you have comes from God. Right? To hold on to it as if it was yours. But you're supposed to take the money that God has given you, and you're supposed to spend it in a responsible way. Right? Not be wasteful, not be prodigal, right? But spend it. When one is being charitable, and charity is an extremely important virtue in Islam. When one is being charitable, again, one is advised to be moderate and responsible in one's charity. Right? This is not the Christian sense of sell all of your possessions and follow me that you have in the gospel, right? That's one way of thinking about charity. It's a Christian conception of charity. But that's not the Islamic conception. The Islamic conception is if you sell everything you have and give it all away to the poor until you're totally poor, then someone else is going to be responsible for you. Right? And part of your job in this world as a human being is to be responsible for yourself and to be responsible for your family. To not let yourself fall into poverty to the extent that you can help it, such that somebody else has to take care of you, or not to let your family fall into poverty such that somebody else has to take care of you. So when you're being charitable, you must also be charitable in moderation. You must give, but give responsibly. And when you do give in Islam, you are supposed to give to the people closest to you first. So the first people who have a claim, so to speak, on your charity are your family members, and then your neighbors, and then the people who live in the same area as you. Traditionally, when Muslims gave their zakat, gave their mandatory charity, it was supposed to remain within the community, the town, the village, the city in which they lived. They weren't supposed to send it very far away. Now, that doesn't always happen anymore, especially now as you have a lot of Muslims living as minorities, let's say, in Western countries. A lot of people give zakat and send it back home. But traditionally, the idea was that it was supposed to stay among those who are closest to you, those within your own community. All right. Another very important form of charity that also involves this idea of temperance or moderation has to do with the taking in of orphans. This was a very important concept. As you'll hear tomorrow, Muhammad himself was an orphan, and the Quran is very concerned with the plight of orphans. And it talks about the fact that it's a very virtuous thing to take in orphans and to raise them. But interestingly, in Islam, there is no such thing as adoption as we understand it here. So you take someone in, there's an orphan, you take them into your home and raise them. You are not supposed to claim them as your own child. Give them your last name. Present them as your son. It's not this idea that by adopting them you are acquiring a child. It's the idea that you are doing an act of charity. So it's really sort of foster parenting. You take the child in and you raise them and protect them and support them and guide them until they reach the age of maturity, and then you let them off on their own. Obviously, a strong relationship would continue between the two, but it wasn't this idea of acquiring a child. Now, in Islam, all children inherit from their parents if their parents have something to bequeath. And so a lot of times people would take in orphans and they would come with an inheritance. And it was the job of their foster parent to hold that inheritance in trust and release it to them when they reach the age of maturity. But the Quran also realized that there might be people who want to take in orphans and support them, but may not have the means themselves to fully be able to support those children. And so it says, if you have the ability to support those children on your own, you should not touch their inheritance at all. You leave it in a trust. When they turn 18 or whatever, when they reach the age of maturity, you give it to them. But it also tells you to be reasonable about it. If you can't afford it, then take just what you need out of there. And so it leaves it up to you to determine where you stand. Do you have the wealth to raise this child completely of your own means as a perfect act of charity, or do you need to take a little bit of that child's inheritance? And there's no one standing over you deciding whether or not that's correct. That's your judgment call, right? And that's your sense of virtue that has to come to the fore there. When we talk about, for example, matters of sexual relations, Muslims obviously are not supposed to be licentious in their sexual relations. Obviously, all sexual relations are supposed to remain within the context of marriage, but they're also not supposed to be celibate. Celibacy is not a virtue in Islam. Now, that's not to say that there haven't been some very pious Muslims who have chosen a path of celibacy, but it is not the normal path. It is not the path that is widely accepted. Right? Because you weren't supposed to withhold yourself entirely